What I'm trying to do over the next 30 minutes is take you through the next step of what the Chief was talking about. And then we're going to reserve a good 30 minutes for questions. Because you haven't had a chance to ask any questions yet, right? This is all supposed to be about a dialogue, a description, a conversation. So that's what we're going to do. What happened, what we're going to do for the next bit. Inside your packs, you have this. I want to pull it out. So if you have your packs with you, if you don't have it, doesn't matter. It's all good. Right. This essentially is what I'm going to talk to you about. Right? This is what we call an artifact. Okay? We publish a lot of stuff. You see a lot of stuff. Stuff is written. Some of it means something and some of it doesn't mean something. Right? What we try to do with this document is we try to capture how Army is transforming for a much more dangerous age. Right? That's what it tries to do. So I sort of commend it to you, and I'm going to use it as the hub of what I talk about today. But you should see yourself inside this document. When you see things change, wherever you are, in your section, in your bit of the tank park, wherever it might be, you should see yourself. And if you don't see yourself, you should start asking the question of, why am I not in this? Is what I'm doing relevant to what Army is doing, and how do I need to change to get it? Does that make sense? Fabulous. All right. So, my name's Colonel Tom McDermott. I run what's called the Chief of Army's Initiatives Group. It's like a little think tank that sits on the side of the Chief's Army. I wrote a fair amount of this document. My team drew it together, drawing it from the Chief's words, and you'll see a lot of the Chief's words inside it, trying to bring that cohesion together. Okay. What we do is we try and help the Chief think about big institutional issues. We help him to try and think about the big things that Army faces. He deals on a daily basis with decisions that were made 10 or 15 years ago by his predecessors, and we help him to think about the decisions he will make today that will impact in 10 to 15 years' time. Where do we start? We start with Australia's strategic environment. Okay? Defence Strategic Review, which you will have heard about, the National Defence Strategy, which you will have heard about, the government's response from a military perspective to this problem is set in this context. That Australia faces the most complex and demanding strategic conditions since the Second World War. Sometimes they say, you live in interesting times. Right? We live in interesting times. What happens over the next 10 to 15 years will set the tone for this region for the next 50 to 70 years, for all of our lives. Right? So this is really significant. Okay? And whether it be, up in Gaza, watching the fights taking place between Israel and Iran, remember that's what that conflict is about. It's not actually just about Hamas. It's not about Hezbollah. It's about Israel and Iran. Right? That is the war that's being fought. Whether it's in Ukraine, the first time we've had a war in Europe for a significant period of time. Whether it be dangerous interactions in the South China Sea, principally being done by our Air Force colleagues at the minute, between our forces and Chinese forces. Whether it be attacks by the Houthis on ships, whether it be climate change, natural disasters. We are in a period of time where the threats are manifesting far more than they have done previously. You might say this is actually a return to normalcy. Right? Since the 1990s, we've had a period of unprecedented peace. Everything here actually looks very familiar to what took place before, and is the norm for the 2,000 years that took place prior to. If you want to look at the arc of that, think about COVID, right? Every time there's been a pandemic in human history, it's normally been followed by a significant period of social turmoil. Happened after the Spanish flu in 1919. So we shouldn't be surprised by any of it. What we can't allow is us to be caught by surprise by it, if that makes sense. You have to remember that we are like a little Western island in Asia. Right? Sometimes we can be described as the Turkey of this region. Right? Turkey sits on the sort of fringe between Europe and the Middle East. We sit on the fringe between Asia and the West. Right? And we live in the most populated area in the world. There are more people living inside that circle than there are outside of it. That is just to our north. Right? The environment that we face is exceptionally challenging for a very large island with a very small population. How's the government responded to that? Well, it's responded by publishing three things. Okay? Well, first, it commissioned a Defence Strategic Review. It got some independent people, experts, to come in, look at our problem, and say, are we fit for that purpose? And the Chief's already said the conclusion was that the Defence Force was not fully fit for purpose and needed to adapt. The government accepted that, and they published two things. They published a national defence strategy that said we're going to do this, and then they published an integrated investment programme to say we're going to achieve the capabilities by spending public money in this manner. The big change is they're going to do this every 2 years. Okay, so we've gone from an episodic series of what they call white papers to a steady drumbeat of defence strategy updates every 2 years. That's actually a really important change. It's not something we've ever really done before. Right, so just be aware of that kind of context that sits around. The Chief talks about the shift from a joint force to an integrated force, and from a balanced force to a focused force. Again, that's quite a profound shift for a military to take. Right? What it means is that we're going to try and go beyond joint. So no longer will our single services come together at the point of the operation. Instead, it will come by design underneath, right? So integrated by design. And we no longer try and balance ourselves for a load of different problems. We're going to focus on our most substantial problems. And for us in this room, that is war in this region. A major war between major powers in this region is our greatest problem. And that is what we are going to focus. For the Army, that means that we've been directed to do one very specific bit of it. Excuse me. We've been told to give this contribution, right, as the Chief talked about, to optimise for littoral operations in our northern land and maritime spaces with landing craft and in long-range strike capabilities. Okay, capable with a credible combined arms land system, principally able to control areas of strategic importance in the region. So if we have to deploy out, fight for, and hold areas of strategic importance. We might talk about that towards the end. That is our contribution to this whole point of a strategy of denial. We're going to use the ADF to deny our adversaries their military objectives. So say our adversary wants to do something, we are going to prevent them from doing it. We're going to deny that to them. That is the whole point of it. If we can get that right, we'll deter them from doing it in the first place. That's something we might talk about again. So what does that look like? It looks like a very different army, okay? This change is not something that's in a few places. It's in every single aspect of our army. It's every face of it. Every facet is going to have to change to meet this line. And whether it be the delivery of the M1A2 Set V3 and deploying them on Talisman Sabre, okay, to go on what was US landing craft but will soon be Australian landing craft, whether it be 1st Armoured Regiment, the tech-scaled battle group, whether it be our shift to a long-range strike and missile capability, launching a NASAMS, and particularly the launching of the first PrSM missile, an Australian precision strike missile, from an Australian HIMARS, which took place the other week. So as the Chief said, there is not a soldier, a team or a formation in the Australian Army that is untouched as we optimise for the littoral manoeuvre and deliver a long-range fire capability. A couple of weeks ago, we made a profound shift. We entered the missile age on the 25th of July. That missile flew 300 kilometres before it hit its target. It has the capacity to go 500 kilometres. Within 2 or 3 years, we'll have a ship strike capability that will come with that. I chatted to the bombardier who fired it a couple of weeks ago because he was at the ADFA Open Day with his HIMARS that still had the scorch marks on it where they fired the missile out. I said to him, do you have any idea the history you've just made for the Australian Army? It's a really significant shift. It's something that we've never had in our history before. Right? So the scale of adaptation, the scale of change is quite profound. Chief talks about this, right? When we talk about the Army's adaptation, we tend to talk about 4 Cs. We talk about the change to our concepts, we talk about the change to our command and control, to our capability and our culture. I'm not going to go through that again, right? But it is a comprehensive adaptation. And the big idea that sits within it is that it's continual. Okay, you can't stop in this environment. It's changing too quickly. So you must be able to build the continual adaptation that you get to. That is uncomfortable for everybody, right? It means we have to hold a load of risk that we'd rather not hold, right? But that's what we're trying to do. So we wrap it all together into this document that you've kind of got in front of you in your bags, right? And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to step you through each part of that document and try and pull out what are we trying to say in each one of those pieces, right, as we go through. So it starts in a not unsurprising place, which is with the Chief's 4 strategic priorities. He set those about 20 months ago. He will not change them until he departs on the 8th of July next year. And then his successor, whoever he or she may be, will then get a chance to review those priorities, see if they're still relevant, and maybe seek to tweak them to their perspective as it comes together. But trust, okay, readiness, resource stewardship, and telling our story, right, are the Chief's enduring strategic priorities. They are strategic priorities. They are the Army's highest priorities. You may have different nuanced priorities at your level that are reflective of it, just like a chain of command works, right? But those are the Chief's biggest strategic priorities. The next section of the document tries to take a big step back from the Army and look at it from its broadest of perspectives. And the Chief talked about the Army in 3 dimensions. That's how he sees the Army, and that's probably the way we've been since Federation, or even before since Federation. Talks about the Army as a national institution, as a profession, and as a fighting force. And we have to look after all 3 of those facets of the Army through our history. That's both the past of it, the present, and also setting the conditions for the inheritance of the future. So this kind of tries to describe that. Talks about Army as a national institution, right? Talks about how we are one of the nation's oldest and most trusted institutions. Right? We predate pretty much everything else. When you wear this uniform, and I'm very proud to wear it as a migrant to this nation, right? You wear the weight of that national institution with you on a day-to-day basis. Right? What we are allowed to do, the power to take life and kill people on behalf of the state, which is why we exist, only exists because we are trusted as a national institution. If we are not trusted to do that, there is no point of us being here. Okay? Because anyone else can do everything else. The one thing that we can do that is unique is apply land power on the land in land combat. Right? That is the thing that refines us as a national institution. To get that right, though, we have to focus on ourselves as a profession. That is a profound responsibility, the capacity to take life on behalf of the state outside of self-defense. Okay, and just like being a lawyer, just like being a doctor, so lawyers can lock people up, doctors can cut people up, right? We as military professionals, as army professionals, have the responsibility to care for our responsibility as a profession. So this talks about the army as a profession. We might talk about that in the question and answers. Do you consider yourself, sat here today, to be part of a profession? Or do you consider it to be more of a vocation? Are you more like a work or something that sits in a job, if that makes sense? And then the third part of it, and the most important part of it, is a fighting force. Everyone in the army is here to generate fighting power. Anyone who's in the army who's not here to generate fighting power is in the wrong place, because we don't have the wherewithal, the capacity to do other things. We should be just generating fighting power. And the quote that comes from Brigadier Mansford on the front entrance of Jungle Training, which is written there on purpose, talks about how hard that is. It's not about luxuries. We didn't join for luxuries. Right? We joined to take on the hard yards of the profession. So that's what this section does. It tries to talk about the army and its borders. We then shift in the document to the National Defence Strategy. And all we do in this bit is we read back to the government what they've told us to do. It's really important that we show to the government that we are faithfully executing their direction. Right? So we literally write out, this is what you told us to do. Okay, National Defence Strategy says a strategy of denial, integrated force, focused force. These are the tasks the Army's been given. Right? Principally developing optimised littoral manoeuvre with a long-range strike capability combined last fighting. Everyone still with me? Fabulous. Great. The next bit's the littoral. Who thinks they know what the littoral means? I'm not going to ask that question yet. Yes? No? What do we think? When you first heard that phrase, do you think, what on earth are we talking about? Maybe a bit? Okay. So when we had the conversation with the chief, we said, hey, look, they've told us to focus on the littoral. When you look up the littoral in the dictionary, it means the part of the country that is near the coast. That is the simplest definition of the littoral. And we said, should we try and explain this in a different manner, or should we hit the topic head on? And he said, hit the topic head on. Right, try and explain to soldiers, try and explain to all Australians what we mean by the littoral. Right, so that's what we tried to do. Part of the country that's near the coast. But equally, up there in that top corner is a really important bit. Right? It talks about how the littoral isn't just beaches. Right? It's the beaches, it's the rivers, it's the urban areas, it's the inland areas, it's the air that rises above it, right up to the space that sits in it. But it is that slice of land between the coast that we are seeking to focus ourselves onto. Right? The military definition of the littoral is the area of the sea that can be influenced by the land and the area of the land that can be influenced by the sea. If you can fire a naval strike missile 5 to 100 to 1,000 kilometres off the land, that's a pretty big littoral area, because you can influence 1,000 kilometres into the sea space. So it's quite broad. When I try and think about fighting in this area, I tend to think of Marawi, right, which is in the Philippines, and we provided support to the Philippines Armed Forces in the battle for Marawi from 2017 onwards. And what I'm going to show you now is a quick clip of some of the Marawi fighting that took place. This, for me, is probably the best image of what fighting in the littoral might look like. It sits in this sort of zone, right? It sits in congested, contested, littoral, urban fringes, right? This, for me, is our future battles. Hopefully, my video is going to be louder than next door, and they've got the chief of someone talking there, so that can drown them out.
used civilian hostages as human shields, mostly women and children.
Pretty punchy fighting environment, right? What's important in that environment more than anything else? Will to fight, right? It's not necessarily a capability. It's the cohesiveness of your team and your will to fight through that sort of environment. How do we build that? So what we've done in this document is we've tried to refocus good soldiering. So good soldiering is a good concept, right? It's about not just being a soldier, it's about being a good soldier as a baseline. Right? We don't want to be bad soldiers, we want to be good soldiers. And all of us are soldiers. I'm a soldier, right? Been a soldier for 25 years. Okay, it's what I've done all the way through my adult life as a soldier. Okay. So when we talk about being good soldiers, what do we mean? We've been about placing good soldiering in the context of the army profession, into the context of the battlefield. The idea of a lethal force in the army profession, not just soldiers, but good soldiers. Right? So how do we think of that on a day-to-day basis? We took the contract with Australia and we've reaffirmed it in this document, but more as a soldier's oath. Okay, some of you may have found the contract with Australia to be useful. Some of you may not. I found it very useful as a commanding officer. Right? But what we've done here is we refocus it. So it doesn't talk about close combat anymore, because actually now it's about land combat. Because a fair slice of our army will be engaging at 300 to 500 kilometres, not in close combat, if that makes sense. So a slight adjustment to try and get that right. So setting the cultural frameworks, and then taking it deeper, right, talking about defence values. The shift to defence values is a good thing, right? That's one of the beneficial things of integration as an ADF. It's quite a significant step. But what does it mean? And the Chief talked to you about this. He said he'd enshrined his view on culture inside this document. And there he has. Our culture is how well we translate our values into how we think and what we say and do on a day-to-day basis. That's simple. So if you're thinking and acting and speaking in line with service values, with defence values on a day-to-day basis in what you do, you are adhering to Army's culture. It's that simple. And if you as an NCO are enforcing that and monitoring it with discipline inside your organisation, you're achieving what you're being asked to do as an NCO. It's a good thing, right? So simple definitions of culture. We'll then talk very briefly about why the Army is where it is and what it is, right? So everyone loves an infograph, okay? This is more about explaining to people who aren't soldiers about the Army. But we try to do it with a slightly different lens, right? That map doesn't explain where the Army is. It tries to explain why the Army has been placed where it is. So why do we have a Special Operations Regiment on the West Coast? Why do we have a Special Operations Regiment on the East Coast? Why do we have the bulk of our combat power along the East Coast next to the major ports with a deployable rapid brigade up in Darwin? Right, why do we need to use the industrial heartland of Australia in the east and the south, which is where most Australians live? You know, why have we got them in those positions? The map is tilted for a specific reason. Because when people think about Australia, they tend to look north and east into the big watery bit of the Pacific Ocean. It's not the case. Our strategic problem lies up the archipelagic island that runs up to Southeast Asia. That's what the Second World War taught us. Right? We also have significant interest in the Indian Ocean, right, on our northwest. So if you tilt the map, everything starts to make a lot more sense when you look at it. Does that make sense to everybody? Cool. The next bit then is about our recapitalisation. We are in an age of austerity. We are fighting for capability on a daily basis. But we are in the midst of the largest recapitalisation of Australian Army equipment since the Second World War. That is without a doubt. We're bringing in capabilities that we've never had before. We're about to have the largest fleet of watercraft since the Second World War. That fleet of watercraft, if it is all delivered, will be of the same tonnage as the current Australian Navy. Right? That is not insignificant when you think about the level of investment that's going into recapitalising the Army. Why are we doing it, though? Right. What is Army's role? So we try to sit down and put in simple terms what Army's role really is and what it needs to be. Again, this is about explaining this to all Australians. So we gave ourselves an Army's role, which is the integrated forces experts in land combat. No one else can do what we do in terms of land combat. That means we are complementary to our Air Force and Navy brethren and cyber and space capabilities that sit within it. And then we have 10 tasks, or 8 tasks, which are up there. Right? They are not in order, but you read them in order, and so we've written them in order. Right? And the first one is very clear. We need to be ready to fight and win wars in the littoral. Really simple, right? Nothing else. Fight and win wars in the littoral. That is our highest priority. And you should be placing that as the highest priority in all of your analysis about what you're doing. Interestingly, I'll let you into a little insight. When we put down support the states and territories in extremis, in crisis and disasters, as we did for 5 years, we had that at about 6. When we ran this through government, they pushed that down to the bottom 1. Right, so they readjusted that down to the last of our 8 missions and tasks. Because they understand that if we don't get the first one right, we're in a lot of trouble. So that's why those priorities are where they are. We then spoke about land power. All right, explaining land power is actually pretty tricky. Right, what's the point of land power? Why do we generate land power? What's the difference of that? The complementary nature of it to air power and to naval power. And we explained it really through 5 advantages. Now, I'm not going to go through these in detail because they're in the book, right? But it's about explaining why do you need to invest in land. And essentially, we provide 5 things, right? We provide presence. That's presence across Australia, 157 bases and operating areas inside Australia. But it's also persistent presence in the region. We had a persistent presence in Malaysia for a significant period of time. We have a persistent presence in Papua New Guinea that's about to expand. For the last 2 or 3 years, we've had a pretty much persistent presence in the northern Philippines through rolling exercises for about 6 months of each year. All right, so we are present, and then we're able to be persistent with that presence. We're not affected by weather, right? We're not affected by the natures of heavy resupply. We can live pretty much off the land if we have a requirement to do so. So persistence and presence are really important. Third one is asymmetry. Army forces are much harder to identify when they're tightly concealed in difficult terrain inside the clutter of our region, like the jungle areas, right? And therefore, if we can have missile systems, for example, in those areas, we are able to apply an asymmetric effect against our enemies, which is about applying strengths against their weaknesses in a way that they cannot respond. Right? That is what asymmetry talks about. The fourth one then is versatility. You can re-roll army units pretty quickly forward without having to bring them back to Australia. That's about defeating the tyranny of distance that exists within our region, right? And so therefore that provides something that's really important. If you can get there early enough and you can plan well enough, you can adapt that military force, that army force, right, pretty quickly. And then the final one is value. We're actually a pretty cheap date, right? When you compare us to nuclear power submarines, when you compare us to major fleet units, when you compare us to F-35s, no offense, they're very important, please trust me. But we are in fact a pretty cheap date compared to other things. So for your 16% that you're investing in land power, you get pretty significant bang for that. The biggest thing we invest in is people. Now, we can argue about that, but in terms of our financial cost, that is our biggest investment. It actually is in wages. Everyone happy with that? So that's the value of land power. Almost there. We then talk about the nature and character of war. The Chief talks about this a bit. Have you guys heard that term before? The idea that war has an enduring human nature, but a changing character. So there are bits of warfare that don't change. It's human. It might change in the future, but not quickly. So war is human. Right? It's full of hatred and violence and enmity and horrendous outcomes. Right? It tends to be fought, started and ended over the land. Right? That is actually a reality of human history. Okay, so there are enduring things, but then there are things that are changing. And as the Chief said, you're in a period of time where the change of the character of warfare is moving faster than perhaps it ever has, but certainly since the Industrial Revolution in the early 1900s. That's probably the last time that warfare changed as fast as it's changing now. There's a big debate, right? What is changing? What's important? What isn't important? And so our point here was to say what we think is important, what the Army thinks is important. So we came up with 6 factors that we felt were important. First one is technology. Technology is without doubt important, but there are no silver bullets. There is no one technology that if you invest in that technology, that will help you win everything. Right, so there's no silver bullets in technology. Second one is sensor proliferation, but also the opportunities that come with that. So yes, there are sensors everywhere now. Drones, satellite surveillance, everything that kind of comes with it. But actually, when you take Eastern Europe and you compare it to the Indo-Pacific, we have much more clutter. Right? There's a lot of jungle. There's a lot of urban areas where you can hide things if you need to. There's a lot of subsurface. Right? So you have to understand that there's opportunity that comes with that sensor proliferation and clutter. Exponential growth in weapon ranges, lethality and speed. If you get spotted, you will be killed much faster than you used to be. Right? So the sensor-shooter link is much quicker than it used to be, enabled by technology, but enabled by digital connectivity as well. It's really pretty important. Then 3 more, mass urbanisation, the littoral, increasingly our littoral regions. 87% of people in our region live within 80% of people in our region live within 5 kilometres of the coast. That's why the littoral becomes really important. All of our submarine cables come through those areas. All our ports flow in. 97% of trade flows in through ports. Right, so those littoral and that urbanisation of the littoral is really important. Tyranny of distance is pretty obvious in the Indo-Pacific, but we're also a region of mass armies. If you take all of the army chiefs and you put them together in this region, they command somewhere in the region of 3 to 5 million soldiers. Those are the ones we're friends with. All right, so when you think about this as a region of armies, the network we build with our close colleagues is actually a huge advantage that we can take. Just about technology, I'm just going to show you a quick video just to sort of break the monotony of my voice. Right. This is a drone swarming experiment being run by the Americans a couple of years ago. Technology has moved on since. So this is 3 F-18s deploying drones from the base of them. These drones then swarm together and conduct swarming activities. The reason I show it is that once you get past the sort of video simulation, you get to the sound of them at the end. And I think this is the terrifying sound of modern warfare. As a tank commander, this is the stuff that really scares me. So that's them deploying the drones. What they look like. Self-communicating. Line of departure. Drone wall. Surround and attack. Horrible noise, right? This is why we're investing $1.6 billion in counter-UAS over the next 2 to 3 years. So last couple of slides. Right at the end of the book, we talk about allies and partners, right? This is our secret weapon, all right? As a small nation with a small defence force, this is our secret weapon as allies and partners. Never underestimate that. The relationships that you guys build by being present and persistent is hugely important. The character of the Australian NCO is valued across this region, and the RSM will talk about this hugely. Right, so never underestimate the power of human connections, right, in conflict. And then very finally, we talk about the notorious and amphibious history of the Australian Army. When we talk to the Australian public, they tend to see us through 3 lenses. They see us through the lens of Gallipoli and Anzac Day. They see us through the lens of Afghanistan and Iraq. And they see us through the lens of COVID and natural disaster relief. Those are the 3 lenses. The lens that is most important now, really, where we're getting all of our lessons, is the Pacific War. Right now is the 80th anniversary of the end of this war, so it's a wonderful time to kind of bring it to the forefront. Right, so understanding this, you know, the war in the Pacific, the fighting in Lae, Finschhaven, if you're going to go and study PME with your soldiers back in your unit, do this. Right, study the NCO lessons from these theatres because they remain deep. So that's it, right? That's what we do inside that document. Back to the start point. Why are we doing it? For this reason, right? If all goes well, we'll all be sat here. Well, I won't be here in 10 years' time, but you guys will. Right? We'll all be sat here in 10 years' time saying, God, didn't we work hard to make sure that war didn't happen? And it doesn't happen. And then we all don't have to go and fight it. Right? That's a wonderful outcome, and that's the outcome we all seek. But there is one future reality in this metaverse that in 10 years' time, we're all sat here in the AAR after the Second Pacific War. Right? The phrase, the time is now and we are it, is a pretty important one. Okay, so that's why we're doing this. None of it's performative. None of it's done for no reason. None of it's just about change for change's sake. Right, it's for this driving reason. Okay. It's also it's not new, right? We're not starting from scratch. The Chief talked about the end of the Afghanistan campaign and how Army re-looked at itself. We were already on a pathway for focusing on littoral manoeuvre and focusing on long-range strike. What the NDS has done is accelerate it. Right? We've got HIMARS 2 years quicker. We've got M1A2 SEPV3 much faster. Getting Apaches quicker. Right, so really what the government's done is, yes, keep doing that, but do it quicker. Right, that's the simple message the government's given us. So these concepts are long-standing. They're just coming much faster than we might have first expected. And the last thing is that Army's trying to keep things really simple. There are two wonderful principles of war that we're trying to emphasise here. Selection and maintenance of the aim, fight wars in the littoral, right, and simplicity. Those are the two key things. Okay, so when we talk about the Army has one vision, this is Army's one vision. Right, the vision is held in this. We'll write another one of these next year when NDS 26, the next National Defence Strategy, is published. My aim is it's not going to be much different, right, because we shouldn't be changing Army's vision that quickly. Right, so if we've got this right, it shouldn't change too much. We're then executing that through one plan and one order. There is now one plan in Army. It's called the Army Plan. You probably won't read it, right, but your chain of command will. And there is one order every year, the Army order. Those are the only orders the chief signs, the plan and the order. Right, so keep it simple. We're a focused force and we're going to focus. Okay? That's me. Hopefully that makes some sense. When you stand up, take a second, a minute, talk to the person next to you, think about the questions, right, and then we're going to sit down. We've got half an hour, and we're going to fill that half an hour with questions. And if you don't have questions for me, I'm going to ask questions of you, which I'm looking forward to. So take a minute, have a chat with each other. We have hundreds of years of experience behind us, so you're going to help us answer those questions as well. Okay, 30 seconds. Okay, take 6, please. Okay, let's go for it. Anything. You can ask me anything. Apart from AFL.
Are you willing to talk more about what we're doing to stop drones, sir?
To stop drones? Yeah, 100%. So is that drones in general or?
Well, so the specific example you showed, you did mention it was dated.
Yeah.
Is that what we believe to be the biggest threat to us in Australia? And if yes, how are we going to stop it?
So the question that sits within that is actually about what lessons are we learning from current war. So when everyone looks at Ukraine, what do you think of?
Yeah, drones.
Drone warfare. Right. And that's 100% correct. So when I go and talk to the guys who are doing Kudu, and you're about to get the presentation from the sergeant who's just come from Kudu, so you can ask him that question, they are now saying that drones are transforming war in Eastern Europe. Right? And a brigade commander who's a friend of mine said that as a brigade commander, he will be as interested in targeting as he will in manoeuvre, because he says those two things are now peers. You can't do one without the other. Right? The question for us is, are those upfront lessons about drones relevant in the Indo-Pacific, or are they subtly different? So are they different because of the environment in which we're operating, the precipitation, the amount of rain, the jungle that kind of sits within it, if that makes sense? The lesson that we take at a big army level is adaptation. So at the minute, the Ukrainians are outpacing just the Russians in drone technology evolutions. And we reckon that they are putting out a new version of a drone capability every 30 days. So they're spirally upgrading their drone capabilities about every 30 days. They're also mass producing them. So a friend of mine who was in Ukraine recently says that every cellar in every house in Ukraine has a 3D printer in it, and they are mass 3D printing drones. And they're close to 3D printing ammunition with the propellant inside. So they're trying to get past the problem that if you try and resupply on the surface, you get killed. So how do you resupply at the forward line? That's probably a more relevant and important lesson to us in the Indo-Pacific than necessarily a specific drone works better or fiber optics are better than something else, if that makes sense. So we kind of look at it from adaptive systems. How do you build the adaptation system so when whatever the drone is in the Indo-Pacific comes to light, we can outpace our adversary to get there? Seems clear that automation, mass proliferation of sensors, all those things are incredibly important. what are we doing? We're not jumping too early is kind of what we're doing. So we're investing in some drone capabilities to deliver to the field army now. First Armoured Regiment, though, are working particularly with the RECO to understand what does that forward edge look like. And then what you don't see is Army building the system behind it so that if the war comes, how do we then spirally invest really fast to then bring into capabilities what we need? The Americans are doing some really decisive stuff at the minute, which is interesting to watch, and we'll learn some lessons from that. So that kind of answers my question, is that we're trying to work on what is the right capability to bring into this region, and then how do we get ready to adapt now? If we just did what the Ukrainians would do, we're going to get it wrong, and we'll be misplaced when we get to the end. Does that make sense? Counter UAS, though, clear, right? We're going to have the ability to stop that. And so actually we're moving much faster on countering UAS than anything else. When the Chief talks about interwar thinking, nothing we're seeing at the minute is new. If drones were a revolution in warfare, someone in Ukraine would have won by now. They're an evolution in warfare. So what we're seeing is action, reaction, counteraction. Someone creates a drone capability, someone else defends against it. Someone creates a drone capability, someone else defends against it. It's been happening forever. Someone creates a longbow, someone creates better armour. Do you know what I mean? So how do you get that system right? Complex answer to a simple question, but does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. Yes, man.
So,
Welcome. Thanks for coming.
Sorry, can I just interrupt? Hey, when you ask a question, can you pay the courtesy of introducing yourself, what unit or area you're from, so that that person that's standing up there, and obviously in this case, Colonel McDermott, gets some context. Thanks.
Leading Civil Trainer and Education Mayor's Hartman, question with procurement of anti-drone technology, would you develop it in-house, or would you look at, say, external companies like Andrew in America and stuff like that?
So again, point question. I'm going to give you an institutional answer. Domestic capability is hugely important. So we need to be investing, and I'm not an investment guy, right? I'm not headline capability, but we need to be investing in sustainable domestic production of mass-produced things, so that when all of the easy flows from overseas come in, we have domestic solutions. A lot of people argue about how many redback armoured fighting vehicles should we have bought. What we actually need to do is buy just enough so that Hanwei will build them onshore. So if we can buy enough of them that Hanwei establish a production line in South Australia, that's a win, because they're building them onshore with Australian steel. Same with the Boxer infantry fighter, so the Boxer combat reconnaissance vehicle. We've bought enough that Rheinmetall are now building them here in Australia. That's really important. So to answer the question is yes, 100% we should be investing in Australian sovereign-based capabilities, particularly for those mass-producible, relatively simple things. The problem, as ever, is scale and cost. If you don't build a lot of them, then difficult, right? The reason we have the new tank, the M1A2 SET V3, is that, and again, this is what you guys don't see, is there was a window of opportunity in the production line where no one had bought tanks. And so the guy who builds the tanks in America came to Australia and said, I can build you these tanks now. The holes are only $100,000 each. We're talking not a lot of money, and we can give you these for about 1.3 billion. And so the government had to make the decision to seize that space on the production line. Do you see what I mean? Because they build so many of them, we got them for a good price. So it really is about trade. Do you know what I mean? But to answer your question is yes, 100%. The other really interesting bit that comes into this is then investment money. So if you can make the defence industry sexy, which is a horrible way of putting it, but that's how it was described to me by a venture capitalist, you can make defence industry sexy, investment money follows. And then you don't need public money to do all the experimentation work because investors will pay for it. So that's what you've got to try and get into. That's the big business of defence. Make sense? There's a question over here.
Sir,
What's the dollar?
So could you explain what is meant by transitioning from a balanced force to a focused force for the Ordnance Police?
Yeah, 100%. Did everyone hear that question? So what's the difference between a balanced force and a focused force? It means subtly different things for different services, and you'll hear different conversations, all right? In the Navy, a balanced force actually has a long history in maritime strategy. It's about having a Navy that can do a load of different things in different places, and lots of people are arguing that a focused Navy is not what we need. That's a separate conversation. For the Army, it's about focusing on a specific high-risk problem set. And that specific high-risk problem set is conventional large-scale warfighting in the littoral in our region. That is our specific focused set. So, will we be asked to do other things? 100%. Right? Our history tells us that, of course, we're going to be asked to do other things. We're going to be asked to support domestic crisis when states and territories are overwhelmed. Are we likely to go and do another Iraq and Afghanistan in the next 10 to 15 years? I would say no. I really would say no. Because we have such a big problem close to us that to do that would undercut our capacity to respond, and that would be too high a risk for the government to accept. Who knows, but that would be my assessment. So, selection and maintenance of the aim. That's our selected maintained aim, which means that everything you do really should be underpinned by that single outcome, which is to prepare to fight wars in the littoral in large-scale combat in our region, really in the next 5 to 10 years. We're entering a period of high risk. Be under no illusions of that. Between sort of 2027 and 2032, there's a moment where nations in the region might look at a problem set and decide they need to act. All right? That is a genuine possibility. Okay? And we would not have the opportunity to sit there and say that's not our problem. Now, I think once we get past 2032, the risks start to ease out a bit. But we're about to enter a pretty high-risk period, which is why we need to act now. The last thing I'll say to that, RSM, is in our previous wars, what have we always had the luxury of before we've had to go and fight? Anyone? Bit of lead time to prepare. Right, First World War and the raising of the First Australian Imperial Force. Second World War and the raising of the Second Australian Imperial Force. Bombing of Darwin was 1942. That was when we were really brought into the war after Pearl Harbor. Bombing of Darwin. When they bombed Darwin, do you know how many munitions they dropped on Darwin? The Japanese, the Imperial Japanese, sorry. Anyone? What do we think? 10 bombs? 20 bombs? Someone have the courage to have a guess.
150.
150? Anyone else?
Have to be thousands, wouldn't it?
115,000 munitions were dropped on Australia in those bombings. 83% of the tonnage that was dropped on Pearl Harbor was dropped on Australia in the bombing of Darwin. Right? The one and only time our country has been attacked by the conventional forces of a hostile nation so far in our history. Right? So that's the scale of what we're talking about here if the worst case scenarios came out in the next 5 to 10 years. And that is why we're a focused force and not a balanced force. Everyone happy with that? Answer the question, Alison? Thank you. 15 minutes. Am I go? Go, James. Hello. Sorry, we used to work together.
So this is a two-part question, so
Yeah.
we'll try and make it work. So the first thing is, so these are both related to retention. I think that's a key topic we need to attack.
Yeah.
So what do you think needs to change for people to want to stay for longer periods, not including like the retention bonus? I don't think that's an outcome. What do you think needs to change for people to want to stay long-term? And further, the talk of conscripts come up.
Yeah.
Do we think we've learned enough from how Russians utilises their forces as basically an untrained force just to do sort of frontal assaults? So are we thinking that maybe is not the best idea to go there then, potentially based on we've now seen it in a conventional warfare style?
Brilliant. Thank you, James. Great questions. Okay, so retention. Our retention at the minute is better than it has been since 2018, and this is not a institutional I'm going to defend retention, right? I'm just going to give you some stats. So we're currently about 9.8% outflow within the Army. That's the best it's been since 2018, and it's close to 15 to 20-year lows, right? So we're retaining better, which is good. Some of that's retention bonuses, but I agree with you. I think if money is our only motivator for people to stay, that is not a good motivator, and it's not the one we should have to tap to get people to stay in the military. Right? You have to remember that armies are hierarchical, right? So they're always going up, okay? And at all ranks, we need healthy outflow. We also don't need everyone to serve a whole full career to fully crew the Australian Army. What we actually need to do is extend people's service by around about 3 to 4 years. So if everyone in the Defence Force in the Army did extra 3 or 4 years, we would deal with a lot of our hollowness issues that come in. Right? I'll make one more point also about the joint group in a second. How do we keep people to stay? Well, I'll be fascinated. Maybe that's something you can talk to us about over this next few days. But I would say that job satisfaction. People join the Army to do soldiering, I think. That's why they join. So if they get to do soldiering, they tend to want to stay and do it for a bit longer, if that makes sense. Our remuneration package on money is actually really good. Defence housing is not too bad. I came from a country beforehand where I got paid nothing and defence housing was rubbish. All right, so trust me, better here than we are elsewhere. Okay. But really, I think it's about the day-to-day quality of the working experience is the thing that will keep people in longer. That means that clarity on mission, reasonable resourcing. We're never going to have everything we need, and nor should we, because the operating environment we'll fight in is going to be really austere, as you saw in Morale. But clear mission, good leadership. The recent Command Climate Survey said that most people, about 75% of us, have confidence in our leadership, right? Inside their unit, which means that our COs are probably doing a really good job, right? About 75%. Does that run all the way up the chain? It's a good question, right? But I also look to you guys, because you are the guys who control that day-to-day working experience. And if on a day-to-day, the working experience that you are fostering inside your section, inside your bit of the tank park, is not fun, is not an enjoyable place to be, if you don't feel safe in it, if you feel threatened, then you're not going to stay in the army for long. You do your ROSO and get out. So it's the simple things, right? It's back to basics. Good leadership, clear missions, well-invested training, well-organised training. He can wait. Those are the things I think that keep people in. That's the answer to your first question. The second bit about conscription is interesting. We start talking about mobilisation of the nation. Chiefs talks about mobilisation. In an era of great power competition, defence and national security is once again a national endeavour, which means that to fight a war in this region, we would have to mobilise the nation. All right? In the Second World War, 1 in 7 Australians worked in the defence industry by the end of the Second World War. We were spending 36% of our GDP on defence by 1945. All right? So, really spending a lot of money, and everyone committed. Mobilising the nation now looks different. It looks like mobilising industry. It looks like mobilising national will and commitment. It looks like mobilising support. Does it look like mobilising people? Probably a bit. It starts by activating all of our reserves, including SIRCAT 2, right? But then we are no longer you can train really someone in 6 weeks to grab a rifle. If we're doing that, we're put it pretty hard. You are specialists. You are professionals, right? So you might need to try and bring people to a professional standard quickly, but we would have to tailor really carefully how much we think that's feasible to do, and not just throw people into combat with a rifle in 3 weeks' work, because they'll die, and it's not reasonable, right? So, we are the professional core that allows the army to grow. How fast it can grow is professional judgment that we would have to get to at those times. But those conversations are live now. How do we mobilise the nation? How do we create will to fight? The most important thing actually is support. If you're going to go out and fight in the Pacific, you want to feel well supported from home. Your family needs to be supported. You all have a contract of unlimited liability that you'll give your life as a soldier to the state, or you want the state to look after your family if you die in your service. So that commitment has to kind of be held to, if that makes sense. So we have to have this conversation. And the thing you're going to do the next 2 or 3 days by hosting this Chief Army Symposium on the armies in society is try and foster a discussion in society we don't often have, which is their accountabilities for their army. We can only do what they want us to do. Does that make sense? If you're interested in that, go back and read some Second World War stuff, Max Hastings, about the way Australian labour market reacted to the war. The unions of dock workers in Australia wouldn't work in the rain. They wouldn't work weekends. The tonnage comparison between an Australian dock worker in the Second World War and a US soldier who was lifting stuff onto ships is quite embarrassing. So as a nation, we have to think about those things. Make sense? Hey, how are you?
Yes. So my question ties into retention, but also recruitment. So you spoke about capability and acquiring new equipment. What's Army's plans on acquiring our people to match our equipment that we're taking?
So my response is going to sound like a cop-out, but it's not designed to be, if that makes sense. We have very limited influence on how recruitment is approached, bar the character of the people we put into Defence Force recruiting and our demand signal that we place into DFR. Broadly, recruiting now sits outside of the Chief's purviews. And one of the challenges that the Chief has is that he now has what he calls shared accountabilities. So he's responsible for keeping the Army healthy and generating battle-worthy forces to deliver to Joint Operations Command for operations. But he has very few levers on prioritisation of inflow. How do we recruit those people? What is the demand signal we're getting? To dispel an illusion, and the RSM of the Army talks about being a mythbuster. To dispel an illusion, we don't have an attraction problem. Young Australians want to join the Army, and they want to join the Navy, and they want to join the Air Force. So applications are up here at the minute, higher than they've been for a very long time. The challenge is getting people through the pipeline. So how do we get them through the medical and the psych screening? How do we run this system efficiently through contracted services to actually get people through? And it's never as simple as you think. So when people say, well, we'll just rush people through it, fine. And then you remember from the Royal Commission for Defence and Veteran Suicide that our highest risk cohort are men under the age of 22 who have only done 18 months service and were medically discharged. So if you get recruitment wrong and you bring the wrong person in, and then they leave the Army after 18 months on medical discharge because they weren't really suitable for service in the first place, they are the highest risk suicide cohort that come out. So how do you get your responsibilities right? How do you balance them well? When you hit a war, it becomes sadly different. Ukrainians, the psychologists of Ukraine at the minute, are working on regenerating people with PTSD back into the battlefield because they need to. Right? We've actually got to get the balance right. What I would say is the media you've seen recently about improvements is correct. Right? We are on a good pathway. However, we're still only receiving about 75% of the recruits we need. We're going to live with hollowness for a generation. And that's a challenge that we're all going to face on a day-to-day basis. The Chief's already made bold decisions, re-amalgamating 5 of 7 RAR, 1st Armoured Regiment, took a brigade and a half of combat power off the Orbat to try and lessen hollowness and try and ease some of that pressure. The other challenge is integration. We have just over 3,500 soldiers who don't work in the Army, who work in the Joint Force. And they're mostly NCOs and officers, because that's what the Joint Force needs. Is the balance of that right? Are we taking too much risk in core traditional military output to generate specialist enabling capabilities? Fascinating discussion they have, and that's one for the department. What I would say is the same things that help people retain will help us recruit. So, quality, tell people this is what soldiering is, and then let them soldier, and they tend to stay. Help them make decisions to move around positions. If someone has a desire for service and they're injured, find somewhere in the military they can work and let them get there. So if it's not in the Army and another service, the last outcome should be you can't serve, even if you want it, or you have to leave, even if you don't want it. We should be finding a way so everyone who wants to serve has the capacity to serve with their fixtures. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thanks, sir.
It's a good question. Hey, mate.
Corporal Kelly, Corp Chief Engineer Works.
Hi.
Task 7 for the Army was maintaining the rules-based order.
Yeah.
How do you see that rules-based order maintained in the mid to long term, considering more and more nation states seem to pick and choose when those rules apply?
So without going too esoteric on you, I sat next to a guy called Professor Sir Hugh Strawn, who's a British academic who will speak tomorrow night. You'll sit and listen to him talk. He was part of the group that came up with the idea of the rules-based global order about 25 years ago. And he said to a certain extent, it's a bit like the guy who invented speed bumps. He regretted doing so. You know what I mean? They're kind of like, was that a good concept for us to build? Because the drama with a rules-based order is that if someone else sets the rules, you might not like them. So there might be a rules-based order in this region in the next 15 to 20 years, but we might not like the rules. Do you know what I mean? So the international system, which has been the guarantor of peace since the end of the Second World War, has been hugely effective. But it is about to be questioned and challenged again in the biggest of senses. So what are the markers of that? United Nations is pretty frozen at the minute, given that one of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council is currently at war with another nation that everyone thinks is illegal, or most people think is illegal. And then relationships with another key member, which is China, are pretty bad. Do you know what I mean? International law is really just an agreement. It doesn't really exist. It's that nations agree to adhere by international law, and if they don't choose to do so, it takes an amalgamation of nations to try and force them to keep doing so. So all of this is going to come under question. Is it important that we commit to it? 100%. Right? As a big continental nation with a small population, we have grown on the basis of that rules-based order, and we must work to sustain it. We're a status quo power. We just want things to stay the same as they are at the minute. Where does that sit in our priorities? So helping Ukraine out is part of a commitment to a rules-based order. That's the only reason for us to send soldiers to the UK at the minute on Cove, is to sustain that rules-based order. If we have to put it on priorities, though, for what we do as an army, what's most important? Defending Australia against threats that are close to us. That's the focused force part of it. Does that make sense? So again, it's a great question. It's one to think about. And in 10 years' time, if we sit here, I wonder what this rules-based order looks like. If we do well, it's probably not dissimilar to where it is today. If we do badly, we might be up against a set of rules that we don't like very much. And our quality of life and our way of life will have changed as a result. Personally, I'd like my children to grow up in the first one. And that's kind of why I'm in uniform, is to try and help secure that quality of life for them more than anything else. Make sense? Yes.
So,
Two more.
Brigade, 74 Squadron,
Hi.
Space Control, Electronic Warfare.
Wow, cool.
So, obviously, very new capability.
Yeah.
It's Joint Force, as you just mentioned. Put you on the spot. There's certain aspects of that that definitely, I believe, should be in an army, especially to support that littoral force.
Yeah.
Is there enough fight? Is there any scope for something like that?
The big question that's being asked at the minute, and it's a good question, is have we cut our coat to fit our cloth? Does that make sense? So have we cut an ADF that we can actually sustain, or have we overreached in the way that we have developed it? At the minute, we can still only grow new soldiers, sailors and aviators through the 3 services. And we probably don't have the funding or the wherewithal to create new chains for space soldiers or for cyber single entry, if that makes sense. We are very top heavy as a result of the expansion of capabilities that we have chosen to do it in a certain manner. There is another world that would see space operations remaining under effort, like it was before, if that makes sense. There's another world that sees Army as a start point lead for cyber operations with others, that you nest those enabling capabilities back under the services. The answer to those questions, I don't know. I don't know where that conversation is going to come out. But at the minute, we have to have a sustainable structure. So when you hear the government talking about taking bold steps to change things, to relook at our structures, that is one of the things that I think they will look at is, have we overreached? Have we cut out broader than our cloth? And if our structures are unsustainable, do we need to bring them tighter back under again? Interestingly, UK have just done something quite similar. They've taken their whole defence enterprise, which was like 12 major, what they call top-level budget holders. They're now 4, so they brought them back in. We've kind of gone the other way. So, we'll see. But I think there's a reasonable argument that nesting it back under the services. What is important, though, is the idea of integration, right? So we will not fight as independent services ever again. There will never be a land operation that does not have air components, maritime components, particularly in the littoral, and space and cyber components that are part of it. So whatever the solution is going to be, it has to work in an integrated way by design. Because again, just bringing things together right at the end of it isn't going to cut it, particularly against the scale of the adversaries we might face in the region. So we've got to think about those sorts of questions really. Just ask the question.
Yeah.
So one more over here. And then we'll go there, and then I'm afraid we're probably going to have to stop.
Thank you, sir.
Hi.
Paul Brown from 28 Squadron.
Hi, Brown. You give me press-ups on a weekly basis, so it's pretty good.
I'll see this.
Yeah, thanks.
Might have touched on it just before, but obviously following on from the Chief's words, for further potential of linking in some city elements or developing emerging capabilities with all of our forces combined to deliver those focused effects. What could those capabilities look like? Obviously, following the footages on obviously the drones, they're heavily looked at the moment, and then the modernising of aviation capabilities in the army aspect, and the alignment of the integrated forces to project those capabilities, and what that would look like in battle space, or airspace, and cyber for the army.
So the irony is that the most important bits of it you can't see. So the joint targeting system is probably the hardest but most important thing we're about to build if we seek to defend Australia at distance. So we can buy as many PRISM missiles as we like, but if we can't detect, sense, use joint precision navigation correctly to then pick up and attack targets, there's no point in having them in the first place. So that is probably the most important thing that links everyone, all of us together, is how do we build this joint targeting system? It's also where we are going to be most integrated with the Americans. So when we think about the Indo-Pacific theatre, you go to Indo-PACOM, you go to Hawaii, you think about like Tasman Sabre and the way we look at these things, we are going to have one integrated theatre using a single joint fire system. That's the aim. And we're getting there in the Army. So on what's called Project Capstone Convergence this year, we used American F-35s to pick up a target in the Indo-Pacific that was then engaged with Australian missile systems simulated from an offshore location with the data being passed live for us to be able to do so. So that's the first one. It's also when you look at Army modernisation, people think about tanks, they think about missile systems, everything else. The land command and control system that sits behind it is actually Army's biggest priority at the minute, $750 million. So if the chief was said, you've got to make cuts somewhere, that's the last place he's going to cut, is that we must have that ability to pass data, sensitive shooter links fast. The secret to it all is logistics, though. So it's not about which missile, it's not about what you're going to hit, it's which missile do you fire, because you can actually resupply that one. That's the secret, is where's the resupply capability going to come from? And that's where you can make the choices, is to fight a war over a long period, not a short period. What I would say is back to Ukraine.
The industrial areas.
100%.
East Coast also for that resistance away.
Yeah. And how do we defend Australia on those lines, right? Just to be really clear, though, long-range strike, cyber capabilities are not decisive. If they were, there wouldn't be a war in Ukraine 4 years later, because what the Russians have relied on is long-range strike and cyber capabilities, right? They haven't been able to ground maneuver, they haven't been able to get air superiority, so don't ever fool yourself. That's interwar thinking. Don't ever fool yourself that long-range missiles and cyber capabilities are going to win you wars, because they're not. What wins wars is conventional military forces taking terrain or defending it. And traditionally, that's what they've done. Last question. Hi. Hi.
The court of public opinion is clearly very important to have with Ukraine, Russia, as well as Israel and Iran.
Yeah.
What are we as the ADF doing to do that in our space, considering the government's approaches to deterrence and fight to kill is probably not the message that we send out?
So what we're doing is we're building trust with society. It's really important. So if you think back to February 2022, to the days prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the most decisive things that took place was the release of highly classified intelligence by the US, the UK, by Canada, by the Five Eyes partners that delegitimized the false flag operations that the Russians were trying to do. That was really important, though, because people believed it. People trusted what was said by those agencies. So when the American government said they're not really going to, they are going to invade, they're not really coming to liberate Russians in Donbass, everyone went, at least in our spheres, they went, yeah, that's true. So what we've actually got to get to is the stage where when we say something to the Australian public in the days leading up to a crisis, they believe us. Because if they don't, we've got a real problem. Legitimacy really matters. That's why behaviours and operations really matter. That's why Brereton inquiry really matters and still matters 13 years after it happened, or those events took place. So building that legitimacy, maintaining that trust right at the top of it becomes the most important thing. You'd be not surprised, though, that what we have to remind the Australian public, and they know this, but it's about reminding them, is what we're here for. We are here to defeat Australia's enemies when they threaten us. And that involves the use of lethal force. And involves the risking of your lives, and my life. So sometimes we just have to make that clear. The discussion on is there a threat is not ours to have. That's for the government to have with the public. The scale of that threat, all the other bits and pieces that comes with it. How they have it, though, defines how much money is spent on defence and all the other bits and pieces. So it is important we help foster that discussion. But really, the most important thing we can do on a day-to-day basis is build trust, that they trust us to act on their behalf in a meaningful sense. Does that make sense? Anything from the GDs at the back? So guys who are just about to go to Singleton? Anything? It's great to have you here. When we talk about you are the next generation, you are now the next generation. One of you might be the RSM of the Army in 25, 30 years' time. Caleb, thank you. Thank you for great questions. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. This 2.5 days, right, you're going to get exposed to all sorts of people. Have the confidence to talk to them, right? Tomorrow evening, you're going to sit in the War Memorial and you're going to watch an online presentation from two of the greatest living strategists in the world, Hugh Strawn and Lawrence Friedman. You're going to have a former member of the House of Lords in the room. You're going to have all sorts of people around. Ask them questions. These people have been thinking about these problems for a really long time, right? Longer than most of us have. So, use the opportunity to really learn and then take it back to units. Any final things for me? If you have any questions you couldn't ask or didn't want to, just email me. I'm very responsive. Thanks very much.